Peter, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us, and we're really looking forward to what you have to offer us today.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much for the introduction, Leslie, and good afternoon, everyone. Really good to be here with all of you, and thanks so much for having me here on campus. I want to thank the Qualitative Research Methods Group as well as WCER for funding this visit. And you know, one of the things I want to talk about when I talk about kind of my own journey as a qualitative researcher is I'm very curious about your journeys as well. And so some of the things I'm going to share with you are very much kind of works in progress. And so I'm very eager for your own feedback and ideas and comments and questions. And so we'll make sure that we have plenty of time for that towards the end. So yeah, I think I'm going to talk about a couple parallel journeys here back to practice. One is a journey of my analytical categories, okay? So we all know about coding and qualitative research. I thought about an alternative title for this talk as being a journey of analytical categories, but I was afraid that truly no one would come to a talk that had a title like that. So I thought journey back to practice. But it's also about my own journey as a qualitative researcher, as an anthropologist of education, as an ethnographer. And maybe that's a place to start, and these will be interwoven here. So just a bit of background. I used to be a social studies teacher, and then I went to grad school in anthropology and did my doctorate in ed research and policy. And I did my field work in Papua New Guinea, and back in the mid-90s. And Dr. Bartlett was just asking me earlier today, so how did you come to choose to focus more after your dissertation work on US-based research? And I said, we were just crossing the street there, and I said, well, I'm actually going to talk about that. So, and yeah, so my dissertation research was on how people in a village in Papua New Guinea, in a town in Manus province, this is where Margaret Mead did a lot of her work, thought about and think about the usefulness of education, the usefulness of school, in an era in Papua New Guinea's developing history where there's been rising unemployment and rising educational credentialism. And so it's harder and harder, even for people who have a grade 10 or at the time a grade 12 education certificate, to get jobs in the cash sector. And there had always been a strong connection between education and jobs there. And so that's what I was looking at there. At the end of my time, one of the conditions of my research visa is that I give a talk at the University of Papua New Guinea. And so I gave a talk there in the Department of Anthropology, and it was advertised with a flyer. And I think the title was something like The Social Cost of Acting Extra in Manus Province. And when I went up the staircase to the conference room where the talk was to be held, a room a little bit like this, I noticed that someone had written on the flyer, why don't you study your own people, you son of a bitch? Right? And so, you know, I was well aware of the post-colonial as well as the neo-colonial climate in Papua New Guinea, right? And so as a white person doing work there were people in the village that would refer to me as Masta, all right? That's the Neo-Melanesian pidgin term for white person, right? And so that was all still, you know, very much a part of the climate there. And so I did try to do work there that was relevant. I published a piece in the Papua New Guinea Journal of Education, and then I published some other things. But part of me was thinking, you know, I was also aware of, you know, the movement in qualitative studies of doing insider research, right? Of sharing certain kinds of characteristics and experiences with your participants. And I was really curious about that, you know, and I'd been a teacher in this affluent school in the Northeast, and I was thinking about, well, what if I did another kind of study for my next study? We have a lot of research on achievement gaps, right? But a lot of that research really focuses on how it is that students in more under-resourced schools from disadvantaged backgrounds keep falling behind, right? Other students. I was interested, what about studying how these kids in these more suburban, affluent, middle-class schools keep pulling ahead? What's behind that? And so that's why I began to do this other research when I was at Ohio State on really the social construction of advancement and advantage through schooling. But before we get there, I want to share with you a little bit about how I think about some of these issues that we're going to be talking about. And and this is kind of dim, maybe we can, yep. Some of you have perhaps been at conferences or certainly been in classes where professors will very recommend that you read certain things in very strong terms. And I was at, I don't know how else to talk about it, right? And so I was at a conference, it was a conference actually where Dr. Bartlett and I met back in 2001, and one of her committee members at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Catherine Lutz, highly recommended that we all read C. Wright Mills, all right? And so this is from The Sociological Imagination, and it's the appendix, it's one of the appendices, I'm not sure if there's more than one or not, to that book called On Intellectual Craftsmanship. And what she was, our conference was actually on doing public anthropology and doing research that's relevant to public life and public dilemmas and broader publics. And so I went back and I read my C. Wright Mills, all right? And one of the key things that C. Wright Mills talks about there is using your personal experiences and values in your research, in your work, right? And he actually talks about keeping files on things, right? And this is kind of old. This is from what, the 60s? 1960s when this came out. And, but I think more importantly, C. Wright Mills argues that your unique contribution as a researcher is going to come at the intersection, he actually says, of these three things, all right? Your own background, your experiences, your commitments, your values as a researcher, all right? Your available research literature and theory, and then thirdly, your empirical data, all right? Now, I actually have the PowerPoint skills of a 4-year-old, so if I was a little bit more advanced, I would actually draw some kind of lines here, all right? But that's where your unique contribution is going to lie, all right? What I'm adding here, and this is just kind of last night and this morning, is for those of us that are in applied fields like education, I want to also encourage us to think about taking into account local problems, okay, including problems of practice, not all of which are going to show up in the research literature. All right. So some of us, some of you are aware that, when you begin to think about a setting for a research project, right? Of course, you're thinking about gaps in the literature, perhaps problems, topics, processes that you want to study. But when you think about an actual setting for this, many qualitative researchers will encourage you to learn about that setting, that institution, that school, those schools, that education system, right? That state, that province. What challenges or dilemmas do they face that perhaps your work can illuminate for them, okay? How can you be of use to them? How can your work be of use to them? And this is also part of what Fred Erickson refers to as scaling down, all right? And Fred Erickson encourages qualitative researchers to think about our work as a practice of scaling down research, right? We frequently hear about scaling up. He says, let's think about scaling down research and using qualitative and ethnographic methods to capture innovation at the local level, all right? To capture innovation and the creative efforts of educators, of school leaders at the local level to grapple with problems and processes. And because there are all kinds of creative efforts and innovations that only qualitative methods, naturalistic methods, can capture. It's also, I think, a way of honoring the professionalism and the creative efforts of educational practitioners and leaders. And so that's why I'm pretty excited about that as well. So just something to think about. A couple other things. So getting back to categories here. This is I realize this is a busy slide. This is from my book that came out in 2009. This is the way I began to think about this local logic of personal advancement in this suburban high school, public suburban high school outside of Columbus, Ohio. So a whole local logic of that kind of cultural system or cultural assemblage that seemed dedicated to personal advancement. And one of the things that, I think I mentioned this yesterday, that Signithia Fordham pointed out when she was, we were at a conference together and we were looking at each other's work, she said that she was glad that I was writing against achievement as an individual act, all right? Because of course, when we think about it, achievements, academic achievements in the United States, they are often seen as the product of individual efforts, but actually there's all kinds of sociocultural influence, ideology, practices that lie behind those outcomes. So this is this whole system, and I want to focus on here, this area here, these student identities for control and success, and especially psychological capital. So this was a whole set of categories. It was a chapter of my book, and I have an article that came out in Anthro and Ed Quarterly years ago on this. So this was all these different components of identities that these achievement-oriented students in the suburban high school seemed to take on that seemed oriented towards success, all right? And some of these have a kind of neoliberal cast to them. So for example, having precociously circumscribed aspirations, these achievement-oriented kids being very, very specific, having very specific aspirations about what they wanted their future lives to be like. In a sense, kind of controlling the future. Anthony Giddens would refer to this as colonizing the future, all right? So I began to be aware over the last couple of years, after I moved to the University of Minnesota in 2007, about increasing attention in the research literature to non-cognitive factors for academic success. Things like grit, perseverance, school belonging, academic mindsets. And I realized that there were actually some real parallels between what I had learned here and these non-cognitive factors. And I went to a big AERA session on this with Angela Duckworth, Carol Dweck, people like that. And I realized that most of that literature comes out of psychology and social psychology, okay? So here's an important point, I think, for those of us doing qualitative studies, right? Most of what we have learned about these non-cognitive factors comes out of experiments and interventions in psychology. I was curious about how young people acquire these non-cognitive factors, these character skills, these academic mindsets in everyday life, in situ, in practice, in schools, in communities, right? Who helps them acquire these non-cognitive factors? How do they acquire them? What impedes their acquisition, all right? So I'd already been doing this 4-year study, evaluation study of a turnaround high school in St. Paul. And this was a US DOE-funded turnaround project. And so I was taking on the role of evaluator as well as researcher, and I was learning a lot about how schools develop and sustain improvement-oriented culture. But I also decided to apply for a grant at my university to study the local acquisition of these non-cognitive factors. And so what I did then was, this is just the cover page of that grant, and I had 2 collaborators on this grant proposal, and we decided to frame it. This was to the Metropolitan Research Consortium on enhancing the competitive position of the Twin Cities metro area. And so we decided to frame this in terms of addressing what we refer to as talent loss in the metro, right? So all kinds of highly capable young people who are not able to flourish in school for various reasons. Talent loss, all right? And so you can see how we kind of frame this. Talent loss being defined as the occurrence of promising students not reaching their full potential, right? And you can see the asset-based approach here, which is an important thread here. And then down here, the next paragraph, mounting research evidence has recently identified promising new approaches to developing this before lost student potential. So in addition to classroom content, right, students must also develop specific skills, habits, attitudes, strategies, which scholars have labeled non-cognitive factors, skills, or dispositions. So you see the move I'm making here in terms of categories, okay? So moving away from the more critical categories that I used in my work on producing success and producing individual advantage into this more mainstream set of categories, okay? And let me just backtrack for a second on critique, okay? Because critique was in the title of the talk. And when I began to present on this, actually I'll go back to this. When I began to present on this work at various conferences, a senior scholar at Texas named Doug Foley, who wrote Learning Capitalist Culture, which is a great critical ethnography. He said, you have very good materials here to do cultural criticism. And I said, okay, well, how do I do that? And then we began to talk about that. And so one of the things that I began to realize is that in doing this kind of work, it's best to lead with the voices and experiences of your participants, okay? In other words, when I began to write the manuscript for that book, one of the things my editor said was that I like how you're not getting on a soapbox, all right? And you are letting your participants and the voices and experiences of your participants do the telling of the story. And as a writer, as a qualitative researcher, you need to structure that encounter between your reader and your participants, right? But I think there's a lot to be said, in the words of more postmodern scholars, to get out of the way of your data, all right, and let your data speak for themselves, all right? And so actually when this book came out, I got a call from the assistant principal of that school outside of Columbus, Ohio. The principal who was there when I was there had moved on, but the assistant principal had remained. And he said, I heard your book came out. I'm curious about it. Could you send me a copy? I said, sure. I sent him a copy. I wasn't sure what he was going to say about it. And then he said, can we talk again in a couple of weeks? I said, sure. So we talked in a couple of weeks. And I was very anxious about what he was going to say about the book, because it was critical of the community and the practices there. And he said, well, when I first saw the title and the pseudonym you gave the community and the school, I was concerned, because the pseudonym was Wilton Burnham High School, and that was intentional. I'd been studying a bit on the anthropology of will, the anthropology of the will, and the term Burnham was in part meant to suggest the highly competitive ethos and climate of this community. And so he said, though, that when I saw the title, I was concerned, but when I read the book, he said, I thought you gave us a pretty fair shake. Are we stressed out? Yes, we're stressed out. Do we cheat? Yes, we cheat. But he said what the book seems to capture is a dilemma that many schools face in the United States today, which is how to ensure authentic learning in a competitive world. And I thought, yes, you said it better than I did, right? I mean, that is the kind of dilemma. And you notice how he's saying that in very clear language, right? That I just, And then he invited me to come and do a book study with teachers for professional development credit in the school. So I went down to Columbus and spent a day with teachers at the school talking about issues in the book and the extent to which they were still evident in the school and not. So you see what I'm trying to work towards there is, and I encourage all of you to think about this, is doing qualitative work that can have multiple purposes, right? It can have critical purposes, right, where you really are trying to illuminate the workings of power in the world and injustice in the world, right? But also doing work that is relevant to the needs of educators and leaders, right? And one of the key things there is to be aware of our own range as researchers and as writers, and our ability to write in different registers and to communicate with different kinds of people. So all of us in this room have that, right? We all have those abilities to take on very different, modes of communication and ways of talking to people, right? And I highly encourage, all of us to hang on to those different registers, right, and to use them to communicate with different audiences, right? So there's a time for specialized language, right? We could talk about the line between specialized language and jargon, right? But there's also a time to be very clear, all right? And so Deborah Tannen, you might have heard about her. She's a linguistic anthropologist at Georgetown who's done all kinds of very well-respected scholarly work. She'll say, she wrote a book called You Just Don't Understand about gendered patterns of communication. She'll say that, and I went to a session she did on this at the anthropology meetings, American Anthropological Association meetings. She'll say that she'll actually take a scholarly article that she wrote or a paper that she wrote for a conference. She'll sit down at the computer and then she'll translate it for her mother, all right? Pretty interesting, right? So she has that different register in her. I just think that's a kind kind of a nice way to think about things, so about doing that kind of work. So anyway, doing critical work, I think one of the keys there is to let your participants speak, to get out of the way of the data, and especially to provide enough context so that your audience understands how it is that what these people believe and what they do makes sense. How the things that they believe, what they believe and what they do makes sense from their point of view. This is kind of the anthropological term, right? Makes sense from their point of view given their experience, given the way that they apprehend the world, right? So that does involve a degree of empathy and empathetic understanding. So I think that's pretty important. So let's shift a little bit, and I want to tell you a little bit more about a couple things. So this other project that I was working on in Columbus, I'm sorry, in St. Paul, and I'm wondering if I just lost a slide. Yeah, I might have just lost a slide. That's okay. Okay, so I began to do this other work in in St. Paul. And one of the things that I noticed early on in this study of school improvement, which was kind of the larger context of the study, was that the principal of the school, this is a very large comprehensive high school on the east side of St. Paul, with over 80% students on free and reduced lunch, okay, so it served a fairly disadvantaged area, is that the principal was very concerned about preserving one of the key shared beliefs in the school culture, and that key shared belief seemed to be belief in student capabilities, all right? And so, for example, he would go to great lengths to not have extensive discussions about discipline in the school, all right, because he was worried where that would go. And instead, he wanted to talk about the school as a learning organization, adults learning, young people learning as well. So that was very, very important. And and I learned quite a lot from this school leader. So I began to do this study of what I refer to as grounded grit, okay, and so that's where that's where I'm referring to the social construction of these non-cognitive factors, that they are indeed socially constructed, right, not the product solely of individual effort. And one of the things that happened just last spring is that the school began to experience quite marked, what they would refer to as discipline problems in the school. Part of this was due to the district's new inclusion policy, where the district was very concerned with trying to move as many students as possible out of self-contained alternative environments into mainstreamed classrooms. And this was a huge effort with regard to addressing achievement gaps, okay? And especially black-white achievement gaps, which had received a lot of press in the Twin Cities metro. And the problem with the policy was the way it was implemented in terms of the time frames. So students who had been in self-contained classrooms were very quickly moved into regular classrooms where the teachers had not had adequate training or time to work together as co-teachers, and the students hadn't had a chance to become socialized into the regular school environment. And so all of a sudden there was a very wide range of reading levels, for example, in these classrooms, and the school people were explaining to me that some of these students get frustrated and then would, some of this frustration would then emerge in the hallways, okay? And so teachers there were getting more and more frustrated. And a few of the teachers there went to the press. And so what they did is, and these are a few of the teachers there, English teachers, and they went to a local, both online and print newspaper, a kind of weekly newspaper, and met with a reporter and talked about their concerns. And this story came out in the end of May. And the story, and I'm sorry I don't have the slide with the cover page here. the story actually had a graphic representation of an African-American student in a hoodie on the cover. And it talked about chaos and disorder in St. Paul Public Schools. And that was the title, Chaos and Disorder. And it opened up like this, okay? So a student walks down the hallway of this high school. This is the high school where I've been doing this work, wearing headphones, chanting along to violent rap lyrics. And this teacher taps him on the shoulder, and he says, "Turn it down." The kid stares at the teacher with chilling intensity. He points at the older man, fingers bent in the shape of a gun, and shoots. Then he moves on. Next paragraph, within the school's quarters is a turbulent clutter of students who push and cuss and bully their way from one end of the building to another. This teacher, Eric Brandt, a finalist for the Teacher of the Year Award, he doubles as a hall monitor. His job, it is his job to somehow tame them. So note the language, all right? And here are the teachers again. And then the teacher in the middle here, Becky McQueen, okay, she has been the teacher for many, many years, all right, and she heads their AVID program. You're familiar with AVID, Advancement Via Individual Determination? Okay, so she says the percentage of kids causing problems at the school was very small. They're not all special ed. But when she tried to intervene in a fight, she got thrown aside. And she said this kid was only sent home for a couple of days. In March, when a kid barged into her class, she happened to be standing in the doorway and she got crushed into a shelf. The following week, 2 boys came storming in, hit a girl in the head, and then skipped back out. One of them had already been written up more than 30 times. Yet another student who repeatedly drops into her classes, hit kids, and cursed at an aide, once telling her that he would fry her ass. She tried to make a joke of it. She said, "Oh, I could use a little weight loss." Her students interjected, "No, that means he's going to kill you." So now, to let into her classroom, she tells her students to use a secret knock at the door, and this led to teachers talking about the problem of, quote, classroom invasions at the school. All right, that was a new term. I hadn't heard that before. All right, and stuck in the middle, and this is towards the end of the article, are principals like Doug Resbeck, who's the principal of the school, whose burden is this urgent moral imperative to do better by underserved students, right? And he talks about the challenges in accelerating learning, and he always talks about accelerating learning for all students, right? And so here's a bit about the superintendent who was recently told about these incidents by McQueen. And she said the school had every right to suspend students when these kinds of things happen, although the district is trying to cut down on the number of students that are suspended, like many districts in the United States, right? And at the end, this is how the article concluded, the message came with an unsettling warning: we'll be looking at your numbers at the end of the year, and what she's referring to there is looking at the school's suspension numbers, all right? So this came out at the end of May, just last May, all right? And after it came out, on the one hand, there were all kinds of reactions to this, right? So on the one hand, one of the things I'd been studying was teacher leadership, all right, and distributed leadership in the school. And this could be seen as strong evidence of teacher leadership, all right? I was also surprised, though, at how the reporter had emphasized the discipline issues in the school over the problematic way this policy was implemented, all right? And she actually interviewed me for this story, and I tried to emphasize that, but nothing that I had said fit into the story. What was that?
I feel like the first half is race baiting. You gotta
Yes.
tame these.
Yeah.
That's right.
I mean, it doesn't say they're black, but these animals, these
That's
black
right.
children who are
That's
just
right.
awry in our school.
That's right. Yeah, so race baiting sensationalist, right? And it got the attention of the African American community in the Twin Cities metro, okay, and including the NAACP, right?
I'm just curious, when the teachers spoke to or raised it with the media, do you think they had a sense of where it might go? Do you think they felt they'd been misrepresented, or do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I think what I can say is that there had been a history of teacher frustration with the district, especially teachers in this particular department in the school, regarding curriculum and curricular change in their particular department. And I think that's actually pretty important context here. And But if you're not experienced in going to the media and being interviewed and being a part of a story, you can be in for surprises as far as how your story gets framed, just like you were saying, Regina. So I think that's part of what happened. For the principal, his perspective was that the school was now on fire, all right? So that was his term, okay? In terms of the school now being seen as chaotic and as unsafe, all right? So he was very concerned. And meanwhile, I had been learning about all these other things, positive things that have been going on in the school. So rising reading scores on the state proficiency tests, a long-term trend over the last 7, 8 years, including very marked improvements for ELL students. The school had a very large ELL population, about 60% Southeast Asian, a large Latino population, African American population, and then a smaller white population. And also the school had been framed and identified as a beating the odds school in a recent panel that the superintendent had put together. Especially in terms of the number of students that were able to embark on college pathways, college and career pathways, especially college pathways in this school who hadn't previously thought about college. And I talked about some of these in my some of these students and this trend in my talk yesterday, and this unbelievable rise in scholarship money and financial assistance provided to Jefferson High School students over the last 8 years, from about $800,000 total about 7 years ago to last year over $13 million in support for college, which is pretty remarkable. And I had this data on how many students there were acquiring these non-cognitive factors, grit, perseverance, school belonging, especially future orientation, which is central, seems to be a gateway asset, young people being able to think about and imagine a future for themselves, especially a future where they have some kind of market value. I had data on how much of this seemed to be arising from the creative efforts of people in the school. So here's more the relevance part of what I want to share with you today. I felt very compelled to write something as a bit of a response to this article that had come out. Part of this, it's complex. Part of it, I wanted to provide a different view. I also felt a bit of the anthropological ethic of reciprocity. This school had hosted me as an outside evaluator and researcher for 4 years. I wanted to provide another view of so many of the positives that were going on in the school. And but time was short, and so I hadn't analyzed my data, right? So Dr. Bartlett and I were talking about this earlier about, what do you do when policy moves fast, when public opinion moves very fast, especially in this age, but qualitative data analysis and interpretation. Okay, I don't even have to say that, right? I don't have to complete that sentence, right? We know that can take a long time. And that can be very, gratifying and fruitful, right? To really immerse yourself in all that. So I sat down and I quickly wrote a response, a different article, and I met with my college communications officer about outlets that he recommended, and he recommended an online and print weekly newspaper. Actually, this is online. Online newspaper called Min Post, and especially the Community Voices session. So I sent this into them on a Sunday evening, and I got an email back the next day saying that they were very pleased with it and they were going to publish it the following day. And so this is what the cover of that looks like. There's a picture of the school that they found, and they slightly tweaked my title, but the essence was pretty much the same in terms of providing a different view, okay? And so just a couple of excerpts just to see how I went about this. And again, what I'm talking about here is I'm trying to speak in a different register, and I'm trying to speak in a way and write in a way that will reach a broader audience, okay? And this is one of the things I'm encouraging all of us to do if we're after some relevance, right? And so this is how I started out. I'm a professor, blah, blah, blah. Been at this school for the last 4 years. Been a guest teacher, so I know the school. Here's a bit about the policy, all right? My work there has given me an insider's perspective. That's another way to talk about ethnography, right? An insider view, okay? It's a little more accessible, right? What's going on in the school? Here's a bit about the school. Largest Title I grade 9 to 12 school in the state. Okay, and then a bit about the context, right? And then I go back to how it was recently identified as a beating the odds school, all right? And here's why, okay? So I'm trying to be a little more punchy in the writing, right? Here's some things. Steady rise in reading scores, right? Principal says that teaching kids to read is like getting oxygen to them. I love that, right? The school's focus on college and career readiness, right? So these are some of the things they're doing right. Now they're admitted to some of the most selective colleges in the country, right? Here's the rise in scholarship money, right? All that. Just a couple other things. So one of the biggest challenges, how to best transition students with special needs from self-contained classrooms to regular classrooms. So I explained a bit about here. And one kid who was struggling with this and was causing disruptions, the principal referred to him as he didn't have the tools yet to cope with the change of environments. Okay, and then I say here, notice the principal's use of the word yet. The principal had used some of Carol Dweck's work on growth mindsets in some of the professional development work with teachers at the school, and he said, you got to know, one of the most important words for us, and if we're going to truly adopt a growth mindset in our school, is the word yet, right? Our students haven't gotten this yet. They haven't learned it yet, but they will. We have confidence that they will, right? So that's that asset-based approach right there. So this hints at the key strength of the culture of the school, shared strong beliefs in student capabilities, right? So here's the growth mindset part here, one of several non-cognitive factors associated with this, grit, so I talk a little bit about that. And then, let's see, and I talked about how the school cultivates these things, right? So talk a little bit about my study there, how they go about these things, getting to know students, connecting classroom learning to student interests and aspirations, sparks, right, that the literature says, structuring learning activities, etc., all this. And then this is how I wrapped up. While learning about all this has been fascinating, inspiring, one of the biggest days was when I was given a key to the staff restroom. All right, so I'd been there for 4 years and never had that, right? It's kind of a nice thing to have. But I said here I was proud to have some sort of membership in this school that I admire so much and is doing such great things. One of the things I'm trying to emphasize there that I don't say is I'm really trying to take a person that I look up to, Norma Gonzalez from the Council on Anthropology and Education, her advice to us as qualitative researchers to treat schools and communities as crucibles for our learning, right? Truly crucibles, right? And to think about them as primary stakeholders and audiences. And we ought to be much more serious about doing work that is relevant to their needs, all right? And I just love the way she talks about this. So then this is the last paragraph of the piece. Teachers themselves hardly ever leave this place for another school. They talk about their connection to the school. And then I wrapped this up by saying, in the meantime, I'm planning to return to Jefferson this year to share with the staff what I've learned. I'm confident the school will have made progress in figuring out how to better implement the core principles of this policy. And then I say I won't have to give my key back. So that's how I ended. And I wrote this in part to provide a counter narrative, but I also wanted to write this for future parents of the school, right? Because that was a real concern in the school community, is what will parents say about the school, because this is a choice environment in the Twin Cities Metro. What will parents say about the school based on that article, other article? So I wanted to provide a kind of counter narrative. So that's what I wanted to share with you, and very curious about your comments and questions, and let's talk.
What kind of response did you get for your article?
Yeah, so the article, it ended up being the second most widely read article in that section of this online paper that year, in the Community Voices section. It had like 800 views the second day. By the second day it was out, and yeah, so there was quite a lot of response, and also just a lot of positive response among the staff. So, and it was very fortunate that it came out the last day of school. So I had a meeting in the school that day, and just a very positive response. One of the assistant principals had printed out the whole thing and pasted it on his door, and so yeah, just a lot of thanks and gratitude for writing that. Yeah.
I've been thinking about, as you were talking about this, the parallels to what's happening in Madison schools now. We had a similar response from public school teachers when this new behavior education plan was implemented, basically an attempt to restrict the number of, to reduce suspensions and expulsions. Admirable intention, right? But also some serious problems in implementation in terms of the tools that teachers were given. And so I think it's helpful to sort of see how this played out in that context and think about it in relationship to here. A question that I'm struggling with is, like, I really appreciate what you say about making the work relevant to the people who are doing the on-the-ground work in schools. As a former teacher, I think that's super important, and recognizing the constraints that teachers are under. How do you fight both fights at once? And by that I mean, like, I think yesterday we talked a little bit about how problematic some of these non-cognitive skills and the neoliberal bend is.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's like this school leader said, how do we prepare students in this world?
Yeah.
So how do we support teachers in working within the context that they are, at the same time that we sort of speak against the bigger problem? So, like, one thing that I'm thinking about is, like, the curricular constraints that teachers are under. So teachers have packaged curriculum that they might know very well are not relevant to their students' lives, and students react against this. It leads to discipline problems, whatever. So teachers might be able to connect those dots and feel constrained in what they can do about that. I'm kind of rambling here, but it's just like, how do we think about how we can support the teachers in the context where they are, make the work that we're doing relevant for them, but then also, how do we do that? How do we do it all?
Does it make you tired?
It does make me tired. It's like, it's this constant fight of, like, maintaining optimism and being skeptical and critical at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it does come back to being able to, realizing that you can do work, you can do a project, an ethnographic project, a long-term qualitative research project, that really can have multiple purposes, okay? And I think that's really important. I mean, we invest so much time in our qualitative studies, right? And one of the things that can be very frustrating is when we don't have the impact that we might feel we ought to have, right? But a lot of that is on us. A lot of that's on us to be more clear about what we have learned and its usefulness, okay? So, for example, the presentation I made yesterday, it really did take a more critical look at those non-cognitive factors, okay? Using a neoliberal frame, to talk about how these young people are, their subjectivity is being affected here, and they seem to be responding and adapting, right? And to this environment. And so that's a more, critical view, using more high-powered theory. But I do also think that there's going to be contributions that I hope that this line of research can make that will be helpful to educators and to young people and to teachers. Okay, and so for example, I really do think that this future orientation component of these academic mindsets is extremely important, and the extent to which these academic mindsets are socially constructed. Right? They're constructed through the creative efforts of all kinds of people, right? So those, I think, are contributions that are more kind of mainstream, if you like. I mean, I'm not sure what, how else to talk about, kind of sociocultural, right? And that's actually the way, we, dinner last night, that's the way kind of that Dr. Bartlett talked about some of this. I appreciate the way you were talking about it, Leslie. And so there's that, and then, there might be other urgent concerns that come up in the course of your work that you may feel compelled to say something about on a more short-term time frame, right? And so that was this other, piece that I just felt compelled to write. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
It's not a perfectly packaged answer. No, I'm just kidding. It's not the one solution, but I guess there is none. Thank you.
I took from your question, how do we support how do we work as partners with educators, even while sometimes we need to critique institutions and curricula and policies, and some teacher practices too, right?
Because they're implicated in that, yeah.
And I have no idea really how to start answering that, but I have long felt uncomfortable with critical ethnography that is simply that's so critical of educators that it kind of paints them as villains, or many of them as villains, because we're undermining the very institution in which we invest all our hope, which is public schools. You know, I think in some ways I worry that we researchers have contributed to the kind of bashing of schools and educators that we see now. And I worry about that. I think it's really hard to figure out how to be a critical friend, how to be, yeah.
I mean, I think it demands certain methodological approaches, right? When we're approaching and working with teachers as participants, that for me, it's like that conversation needs to be sort of open throughout the process. I think also what you said that really resonated for me was about trying to understand how what they're doing makes sense in the context that they're in. So like teachers who are like I work with young kids, I do early childhood education, and teachers who are interventioning kids to death, like 5 reading groups a day, phonics drills. It makes sense within the sort of currency of their schools and how they see these, like how they see what these kids need to be successful in this system. I don't know.
Just one quick thing I would add, and then I know we have some other questions here, is one of the people that I really look to in doing publicly relevant work is Michelle Foster, African-American anthropologist of education based in California. And she said years ago that ethnography can function as a kind of mirror that reflects back to people and shows them themselves in perhaps a different perspective. And the mirror, she points out, can be adjusted to emphasize certain things, okay, and other things. And I think that's really helpful. And so, you know, one of the things that I didn't share is when I did that other study back in suburban Columbus, Ohio, one of the most important comments I got came from a different assistant principal who said, and this is actually a different component of the work that I shared to the staff there, she said, "Thank you for helping us to see ourselves." And that's something that we can do, you know, that's something that we can do, because we can bring to light assumptions that guide practices that people may not be fully aware of, right? So that's one thing to think about.
I have a couple of related questions. I guess I wonder what the feedback was from the scholarly community, your very public advocacy as far as the school is concerned. You've expressed strong allegiance to the school. I wonder if that affects your ability to look at the school critically in the future.
I appreciate that, and I worry about that. I don't know yet, you know. When this came out, I shared it with my colleagues in my department at the University of Minnesota, and actually at that moment, the response was quite positive, you know. We are a university, like many universities, that is trying to become more publicly engaged. Yet, as you say, I am being quite open about my advocacy here, right? And I haven't yet tried to publish anything from this project in a scholarly journal, but this is going to be out there, right? Excuse me. So I'm just not sure. I'm not sure. But the other part of that is that I was wondering if the teachers who went to that reporter felt that my piece had kind of undermined their efforts, right? And I met with one of those teachers last summer, and I asked her that. And she said, you know, she wasn't one of the 3 in that picture, but she knows them all. She said, you know, they might have felt that way, but I don't think they actually did because they know you so well, right? And I've known them all for 2-3 years at this point, you know, and kind of, you know, been with them through some stuff, you know, in the school. So I'm still kind of waiting to see both of those areas, you know, the teachers themselves, you know, that were really pushing for changes. I do wonder about the extent to which I had a negative impact on some of that gravity, that momentum. But also, yeah, the scholarship, I'm still kind of worried about that, you know.
So you're now a player. I mean, you're in the debate, sort of, and you've sort of staked out a position that may be contrary to what the teachers have suggested. I mean, are you done with that school? I mean, are you done looking at the school? Are you done doing research there? Do you feel like you might go back?
I'm done doing the evaluation component of this turnaround project. And I would hope that I'm done with my data collection for my work, because I've been working at it for 4 years. So now I'm moving more into data analysis and interpretation. The principal of the school has become a research collaborator. He and I are presenting at a conference in Glasgow in January, International School Improvement and Effectiveness. Right? He's a very conceptual thinker about school improvement, and I think that's going to be exciting. Yeah. But yeah, no. So what are you thinking there? I mean, about kind of the shift in roles. I'm curious.
What am I thinking? I guess I haven't come to conclusions. I don't know anthropology as a field really at all, and so I'm coming at this thinking about, you know, what there might be. Well, what do I think? What I think is that it'd be very difficult for staking out the position that you've staked out. It'd be difficult for that to not affect how you interact with the school moving forward.
Yes.
Not just in terms of your ability to look critically at the school, but also maybe your ability to interact with faculty at the school who believe differently. That might have really very different opinions than you've expressed really very publicly.
Yes.
I don't know what that means in terms of research. I mean, we're hearing a story from you, so I'm inclined to think like, well, that was cool. I mean, that was a nice article. And I really disliked the tone of the previous one, so I'm very happy that something was done to counter that. But I do wonder, like, what happens next?
Yeah, I really appreciate that
Can I
comment.
say a few things in response to that? I think so it sparks so many directions of thought for me. I may not be organized in expressing them all. One is, within anthropology of education, there is a lot of that kind of advocacy work. And there have been debates over whether you should be publicly positioned and what the impact would be. And there have been people who've said, that there's so much work to advocate that we're too quick to advocate, we as a field. And so there have been interesting debates within AnthroEd about that, and there's some that are published in AnthroEd Quarterly that might be worth looking at. Another thing I think about is, in some ways it could benefit the research because people don't know what anthropologists are. They think like, why are you hanging around here? What are you doing? I think you had a more defined role, especially with the early evaluation work, than most anthropologists do. So in some ways it might be reassuring to people to kind of get a sense of where you stand, and then they can disagree or agree, but having something to react to in some ways might be easier. That's one thought I had. And then I had a third thought, which was, to finish that second thought, I think in some ways not having an identified stance can also be a liability and can shut down possibilities in some way. And then I had a third thought that I can't remember right now. I can't remember it right now. It'll come back to me. But I think there are debates within the field about position and public positions and whether they jeopardize our ability to be critical in other contexts. I think my third thought was more about like audience and it was about reciprocity. So when I think about like this article, this newspaper article probably meant more to that school leader than any journal article he would ever write.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It was much more valuable, and he could say it because of his position at the university
Right.
in a way that would get taken up, whereas other people might not. And so I think a lot about reciprocity. What do we owe to the educators we're working with? And even while I'm cautious about advocacy, I also feel like we owe some form of reciprocity, and what might that be? What might that contribution be?
And we use the word advocacy,
Yeah.
but it's you're advocating for a particular position that perhaps other agents invested in the school disagree with. So
Yeah.
is
Yeah,
that
right.
advocacy?
Who are you advocating
Right,
for?
Right, and
Exactly.
Yeah.
with a big voice.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
You are a doctor, you are,
Yeah.
you're a researcher.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that comes along with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And part of that, again, is, I'm sure we all have concerns about, the influences on school policy, but at the local level, the district level, and I think sometimes we get frustrated. I've certainly been frustrated at what seems to push things around, And so, yeah, I was making a decision here to, as you said, get more out into, the ring, and but you're right. I mean, I'm tenured at this point. I've been around for a little while, and I was curious about what taking on a role like this would mean, and but I did feel this compulsion to write that, for all kinds of reasons, right? And that's one of the things I've learned about in public anthropology is we need to write more from first instincts. We need to write from those first instincts, and we should be aware when we're self-censoring, right? And when we're self-censoring, what is really happening there, And so once I kind of found the voice for this piece, it just kind of, just came out and wrote itself. Yeah. Yeah.
Question. It seems to me like your work in Ohio or in Minnesota, first one is about studying the suburban high-tuned school. Another is about like a school for like a mixed group, maybe more low-income students. Both of them are public school. The reason why your work can reach the different audience and can influence practice and the policies is because as a researcher you share the similar public position with the public schools, right?
Yeah.
Even you critique the
Yeah.
suburban school, the principal read that you was anxious about that, but finally you got like positive comments on that. But in some case, for example, I'm writing my dissertation. My dissertation is writing about Chinese elite public schools, but the public school is different from the elite school in the United States, because United States is more, we talk about elite schools, more private, right? But in China, there is a elite school mostly focus on the public school. But the things because in China, the neoliberal reforms, neoliberal ideas really impact what's going on in the school.
Mm-hmm.
The program I'm studying is an international curriculum program created by elite public school in big cities, cosmopolitan and metropolitan cities.
Interesting.
This new program, international program, actually exclusively designed to prepare wealthy Chinese high school students to study abroad, apply for U.S. college.
Mm-hmm.
So when I conducted my field work in China, so because I was at the school I studied is, like I was a former teacher there, but they created the international divisions because I have the access to the school. So I basically, I was concerned because the whole environment in China, it's not people because of the influence of neoliberalism, school principals, administrators, and teachers, let's think about what does mean public school. What's the purpose of public school? Because this whole environment is there. So I decided, not expose my public position. It's kind of like I have to hide that because people cannot accept your critical perspective on that. But interestingly, what you shared today, like the principal asked, like interested in reading your work, that is exactly happened to my research. The principal said, okay, you write in English, someday please translate it in Chinese. We want to share that. Because the knowledge I know, as a Chinese, I know sometimes they wanted to use my work to advertise the school, right? Because their culture is like basically similar to people's working in elite public school in these countries. It's more elite narcissism. They really appreciate like the elite school culture, something like that. So, but as a critical researcher, I'm not only criticize them, the problems. Sometimes like I want to make my work contribute to their practice, right? So it's hard for me to figure out the way, especially the culture difference between public school here and public school in China. I'm really concerned about in the future, if they read my work, how will respond to how that will change the attitude to me and change my future access to the school. Because I plan to want to continue to the longitude study with the school because for several reasons. So I guess my question is, given this situation, what do you suggest? I valued on the one hand, I valued the importance of writing for different audience, but you have to think about the institution culture and the culture, the whole the context of different culture in certain nations. What suggestions do you have? Especially you study the elite group, elite institution.
Well, I do think that, and it sounds like you're doing very interesting work, and it speaks to the topics that you have chosen and the quality of your work that this particular school leader wanted this piece to be translated, right? And so that says a lot, I do think that, like Leslie was saying earlier, in doing critical ethnography, we should be aware of kind of feelings we might have of not wanting our participants to read what we write, right? That should signal something to us, right? And that should signal to us maybe that we haven't done what we need to do in terms of adequately understanding, that kind of emic local logic, right? That has, again, led people to believe the things they believe and do the things they do, right? And I think that's part of it, and then again, using voice and using experience and using, what we have learned and leading with that, in our accounts. And then, taking responsibility as researchers for that and taking responsibility and being open to dialogue. And it sounds like that's the direction that you're going. And I really encourage you to pursue that direction, and to think about those different registers as well, and even if we're using specialized language, so a term like agency. So I remember, Jim Peacock at a conference from North Carolina. I think he was another one of Leslie's committee members at North Carolina. One of the things he said was, and this is again on public anthropology, he said, the guys that hang out down at the corner store, they know what agency is. They just don't call it that.
I feel like I'm in a similar dilemma. Not with like my work being used for advertisements, but being concerned with like how my work will be taken up by the school. So I also conducted an ethnography, and I looked at Mexican English learners in a semi-rural high school. And I have two things that I'm thinking through. Both like I want to do something in terms of reciprocity for the students in particular, because I feel like their stories are extremely powerful and something needs to change. And so I feel like those stories need to be shared at the school in order to hopefully provoke some sort of change.
Yeah.
At the same time, I mean, my focal teachers in this study were the three English the EL teachers. And so anyone who reads this study and knows the study took place there knows who I'm talking about. And so I'm concerned about them. They did some problematic things, but as you say, like, there are reasons that they're doing problematic things, and there's bigger issues at play. And I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned that sharing my research will create individual blame among some of my participants, when I want the effect to rather be a look at the larger practices of the school. And so I'm concerned, like, should I just send them my dissertation? Because I have the ELL coordinator say, I'd really like to read this when you're done. B, I don't really want to do that because I feel like I want to have some control over how it's understood. So I don't really know the best way to do that.
I had to piggyback off that of just, maybe they did, I'll pretend my advisor isn't here, but maybe like.
Here, I'll stand here.
Whisper. Okay. But I think the form of the dissertation just isn't, it's for the academy, but it's not for, I think, the people that we do our research with. And so how can you, because I feel like when you're in a PhD program, you know, it's a marathon, and like what they officially want is a dissertation, not, you know, a nice article, an article like in a publication, excuse me, not in a publication, in a newspaper. So how can you, I just feel like the structure of the program, it doesn't encourage you presenting your work in other ways besides like journal articles, a book, a dissertation. Like what are other forms of sharing your work that are better, and how do you find the time to do that when that's not the institutional constraints on you are not to produce that?
Yeah,
Or maybe that's maybe like a bigger picture question of like the academy and what is accepted as scholarship. But
I mean, for me, a lot of it has to do with just a strong motivation to be useful, to try to be useful. And I think that, look, let's be really honest. I think that people in universities have towering powers of rationalization, all right, to rationalize the usefulness and the value of their work. Towering powers, truly, okay? And all right? And we've all seen this, okay? We've all seen this, okay? You know, one of the people I really look to for guidance on this early on, and I think I've told Dr. Bartlett about this, is so Barbara Kingsolver, novelist, okay? And she had I was talking with another student about this earlier, another faculty member earlier about this today. One of her early books, Animal Dreams, she talks about, she has a protagonist, a young female white person who's kind of drifting through the American Southwest, doesn't really know what she's going to do. She's like in her early 20s. And then she becomes a science teacher. And her realization is that a big part of happiness is having a use, like a sweater or a socket wrench, right? And I love that. I mean, to me, that's very motivating. And that's partly why I'm here and doing, you know, the title of the talk in terms of both critique and relevance. And that relevance part, you know, I think you have to be creative. And you have to listen, you have to pay attention to what the possible avenues might be where you could communicate part of what you have learned. And going back to your question, I think going back to what, you know, a qualitative and even an anthropological approach can contribute is reframing the conversation. All right, so this again is Jim Peacock, right? And, you know, what anthropology can do. And so it sounds like there are certain concerns in that community, right, that you are concerned about either contributing to or kind of fanning, you know, heightening, inflaming, this kind of thing. But one of the things perhaps you can draw upon what you have learned to do, your data, is to reframe the conversation, right? And that perhaps is another way to think about other things that can come out of our projects, you know? And, you know, again, it's like, I think that we're all capable of all kinds of things. You know, we're capable of writing for scholarly audiences, like you say, but also we're capable of writing for other audiences as well. And those things might be more gratifying, you know?
So I think in a situation like that, both of your situations, it would be worth writing something that might be the equivalent of an executive summary or a short 5-page document where you highlighted main findings and you made arguments about the systemic nature of treating, you know, bilinguals or ELLs, and even had some bullet point recommendations that would be worth discussing and debating. They may well even disagree, but
Yeah.
so she asked for the dissertation. She might eventually find the dissertation, but I think as scholars we do have to think about risk, the risk of participants and trying to protect them from that. And so writing a different document with a different purpose might be worthwhile, and it could be
Yeah.
a really
I like
huge learning opportunity
Yeah.
for you to present it and discuss it
Yeah.
with the chair or the educators or a full faculty meeting or something like that. And I don't think that's a dodge, because they don't have time to read a dissertation anyway.
Right.
And you are trying to protect people, and you have to think about utility and audience and avoiding that individualized blame. So
Mhm.
Yeah, good idea.
thank you so much for being
Oh,
with us at
thanks,
lunch
all of
today.
you.
I hope you got to eat something. I
Sure
hope
did.
all of you will take a whole pizza home.
James and I are taking it to EPS tonight.
Excellent. Good.
Yes, we are.
That's taken care of. There's an
The doctoral.
Oh, okay.
From 6 to 9
Not on my
p.m.
Thank all of you for being here. Please grab pizza and soda on the way out. And thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Yeah, thank you.